For years, a powerful billionaire lived in complete isolation with his only son, a boy who was born both paralyzed and unable to speak, diagnosed with severe autism. Doctors gave up, therapists failed, nothing changed. The father, despite all his money and influence, couldn't reach his child. That was until a new maid arrived at the mansion. Quiet, gentle, and grieving her own loss, she didn't try to fix the boy. She simply stayed. What happened next would uncover a shocking truth and change all of their lives forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Wakefield lived in a huge, quiet mansion far away from everything. After becoming one of the richest men in the country, he decided to leave his business world behind. Now all that mattered to him was his son, Noah. Noah was born with severe autism and physical paralysis, and he had never spoken a word in his life. Richard's wife had died a few years earlier, and since then, his only goal had been to take care of Noah. The mansion had doctors, therapists, and special equipment everywhere. Every morning started the same way. Richard sat by Noah's bed, hoping for a reaction. But Noah always stared ahead, saying nothing. Even a small sound or movement would have made Richard smile, but it never came. Despite everything, Richard never missed a day. He read books to him, played soft music, and tried to talk, hoping his son would understand. But the silence never changed. Richard spent millions on medical experts from around the world. He flew them in on private jets and offered huge payments if they could help Noah. Some doctors stayed for weeks, trying new methods, running tests, or suggesting different routines. Others left quickly after realizing there was nothing more to do. Therapists came and went, speech therapists, occupational therapists, even experimental researchers. Some tried new communication devices, others focused on sensory responses. But no matter what they tried, Noah remained silent and still. Richard kept detailed notes on everything. He made sure his staff followed strict routines, hoping that structure would help Noah feel safe. Every room was adjusted to meet Noah's needs. Temperature, lighting, and sounds were all controlled to avoid causing him any stress. Yet, after every effort, nothing changed. Richard felt the weight of disappointment every time a new attempt failed, but he refused to give up, even when it seemed hopeless. Most days, Richard didn't leave the house. He had meetings over video calls, but his thoughts were never fully in them. His full attention was always on Noah. He learned about autism, therapies, and brain functions by reading every article and book he could find. He kept a journal of Noah's behavior. Even the smallest changes, a glance to the side, a flicker of the eye, were recorded and studied. He believed that maybe, one day, he'd see a breakthrough. Every meal, Richard sat beside Noah, talking slowly, describing what was on the plate. When he took Noah for walks around the garden, he gently held his hand and spoke about the plants, the sky, or memories of his wife. These daily moments gave Richard a small sense of peace, even when there was no response. He hoped that somehow his son could feel the love behind every word, every movement, even if he couldn't show it. At night, the house was quiet. Richard often stayed awake, watching the monitors that showed Noah's room. He had cameras installed to make sure nothing was missed. He watched the screen for hours, hoping to see something different, maybe a hand move, a change in facial expression. But most nights were the same. Noah slept calmly, without sound or movement. Richard sometimes walked quietly into the room and sat in a chair beside the bed. He whispered to his son, talked about memories with his mother, or just stayed in silence. These nights were hard. The stillness made Richard feel alone. He missed his wife terribly, and more than anything, he wished she could see how hard he was trying. Sometimes he cried, quietly, not out of weakness, but because the silence was too strong. He often asked himself if he was doing the right thing, but every time he promised himself he would keep going, for Noah. Richard had power, money, and all the connections he could ever need. In business, he could solve problems quickly. If something was broken, he hired people to fix it. If a deal failed, he made another one better. But with Noah, none of that worked. No amount of money could change his condition. No expert could guarantee a result. Richard hated feeling powerless. It was something he never experienced before becoming a father. His life had always been about control, success, and results. But now, everything depended on something he couldn't force, a reaction from his son. This feeling of helplessness was new and painful. He kept trying anyway. Every decision, every action, every dollar spent was for one goal: to hear Noah speak. He imagined it often, just one word. It didn't matter what the word was. Even a simple "dad" would change everything. That dream stayed in his heart, giving him the strength to keep going. One afternoon, like many others, Richard sat in the therapy room with Noah. A therapist was playing with sound devices, hoping to trigger a reaction. Richard watched carefully, silently hoping that today would be different. Noah sat motionless, his eyes half open, showing no interest in the noise. After a while, the session ended. The therapist shook her head gently and left the room. Richard stayed behind, sitting next to his son. He held Noah's hand and whispered softly, "I'm here, son. I'm not going anywhere." He sat there for a long time, saying nothing more, just holding Noah's hand and listening to the silence. This silence, which once made Richard feel so broken, had now become something he learned to live with. It was painful, but it was honest. He was a father who loved his son deeply, no matter what. And despite everything he had done, all he wanted was one thing: to hear his son's voice for the first time. Julia Bennett arrived at the Wakefield mansion on a rainy morning. She didn't bring much, just one suitcase and a folded photo of her baby girl, who had died only months earlier. Julia didn't talk much during the interview. Richard Wakefield barely asked questions. The agency had recommended her as someone quiet, efficient, and trustworthy. That was enough. Richard didn't expect much. Most employees didn't last long in the mansion. Some couldn't handle the silence. Others left because they couldn't connect with Noah. But Julia was different from the start. She walked through the house slowly, observing everything without saying a word. She didn't ask about the expensive equipment or the long list of instructions. She listened. When she was introduced to Noah, she didn't try to shake his hand or get his attention. She simply nodded and sat in a corner of the room, folding laundry, as if she had always been there. She respected the space, and for some reason, that felt right. Julia didn't treat the job like a task. She moved quietly through the halls, doing her work without drawing attention. In the kitchen, she cleaned without turning on loud music or making unnecessary noise. She didn't ask questions about Noah's condition. She didn't try to give advice or share personal stories. She just did her job and stayed calm. Richard started to notice her behavior. She never rushed, never forced a smile. There was no fake cheerfulness. It was like she understood that this house had its own rhythm, slow, silent, heavy. Julia didn't fight that. She adjusted. At lunch, she sometimes sat nearby while Richard fed Noah. She didn't offer help unless asked. She didn't look away from Noah, but she didn't stare either. Her presence became part of the background, not intrusive, just steady. It was strange, but comforting. Richard, who was always tense around new people, didn't feel the need to explain himself to her. That was new for him. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. It was hard to say why. Nothing major had changed. Noah was still silent, still distant. But the feeling in the house was lighter somehow. Richard found himself less exhausted by the end of each day. Julia continued to stay near Noah during parts of the day, never speaking directly to him unless it made sense. Once, she placed a soft blanket on his lap without saying anything. Another time, she opened the window slightly when the room felt warm. These small actions, done without fuss, started to matter. One afternoon, Richard walked into the room and saw Noah's eyes following Julia as she moved from one side of the room to the other. It was a tiny movement, but it caught Richard's attention. He didn't say anything, but he felt it. Julia hadn't tried to get Noah's attention, but she had it. And that, somehow, made more difference than any therapy session. Richard began to think more about Julia. Not in a romantic way, but with curiosity. Who was this woman who had managed to fit into the hardest part of his life without making noise? He checked her file again. No red flags, just notes about her being responsible, quiet, and recently going through a personal loss. He didn't ask her about it. He could tell she was still hurting. He recognized the same sadness in her eyes that he saw in the mirror. One evening, as they passed in the hallway, Richard stopped and said, "Thank you for what you're doing." Julia looked surprised, but nodded softly. "You're welcome," she said, and kept walking. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was the most they had said to each other since she arrived. That short exchange stayed in Richard's mind for the rest of the night. It was the first time in a long while that he had felt like someone else understood the silence. More time passed, and Julia's presence continued to change things slowly. The staff noticed it too. The mansion felt less cold, less like a hospital. Julia didn't talk much with the other employees, but they respected her. She always helped when needed, never complained, and never acted like she was above the work. When new therapists visited, she greeted them politely but didn't try to impress them. She focused on Noah, even when it didn't seem like he noticed her. But he did. One day, during a therapy session, Noah turned his head slightly when Julia entered the room. It was small, barely noticeable, but Richard saw it. He didn't say anything, but inside he felt hope. Julia was doing something no one else had done, not with words or plans, but with patience. She didn't try to break the silence. She lived inside it. And that small difference was creating real change, one quiet moment at a time. Richard had seen dozens of professionals try and fail. Each one came with confidence, promising results. They used fancy tools, new theories, and hopeful smiles. But they always left with disappointment. Julia didn't promise anything. She didn't ask questions or try to prove herself. She was just there, present, calm, and steady. Richard noticed that Noah seemed more relaxed when Julia was around. He didn't smile or speak, but he seemed more at ease. The house, once full of stress and pressure, now felt like a place where something real could happen. Richard still didn't know exactly what Julia was doing, but for the first time in years, he saw a difference that couldn't be explained with science. Someone was finally fitting into the silence without trying to fix it. And that, somehow, made all the difference. Julia's arrival had quietly changed the atmosphere of the mansion. Richard didn't say it out loud, but he knew it. Something was happening, and it had already begun. Julia started to notice small things about Noah that others had missed. At first, they were tiny reactions. One morning, while she was washing dishes in the kitchen, she heard the sound of the tap running and saw Noah move his fingers slightly. He was sitting nearby, as usual, in silence. But something about the sound of the water had reached him. Later, she watched him as it began to rain outside. His eyes slowly turned toward the window. He didn't smile or speak, but he looked at the falling rain for a long time. It wasn't just a random glance. There was something focused about it. Julia paid close attention from that moment on. She began to test things quietly, without pressure. When the gardener used a hose near the back door, Noah's eyes followed the sound. Julia realized that water, in any form, seemed to connect with him. It was the first real pattern she had seen in his behavior. She started using this discovery gently. Julia didn't say anything to Richard at first. She didn't want to create false hope. Instead, she adjusted the daily routine in small ways. During the late mornings, she took Noah outside. Not too far, just to the edge of the garden, where there was a stone path near a small fountain. She didn't ask him questions or give him instructions. She simply walked beside him, pushed his wheelchair slowly, and let the environment speak for itself. When they got close to the fountain, she noticed it again. His body relaxed slightly, his breathing slowed, and his fingers moved just a little more. Sometimes he would look toward the water, as if trying to understand it. Julia didn't push for more. She brought him there almost every day when the weather allowed. When it rained, she opened the window just a little in his room so he could hear the sound. Each time, Noah seemed calmer. One afternoon, Julia sat beside Noah near the edge of the pool. She placed his chair under the shade and sat on a nearby bench with a book. She didn't read aloud, and she didn't ask him to listen. She simply let the soft noise of the pool filter into the background. Julia was careful never to make him feel tested. This wasn't therapy, it was just being present. After about 15 minutes, she noticed something new. Noah's head turned slowly toward the water, then his hand twitched slightly. His eyes didn't wander, they stayed fixed for a short while. Julia said nothing. She just waited. Moments like that didn't last long, but they were different. His attention was no longer floating everywhere. It was here, with her, and with the sound. These were not accidents. Over the next few days, the same thing kept happening. The more time they spent near water, the more responsive Noah became. Not in big ways, but in small, real ones. Eventually, Richard noticed. He saw the change in routine first. Julia was spending more time with Noah outside, and his son seemed calmer afterward. One day, he watched from the window as Julia pushed Noah toward the garden. Noah wasn't resisting like he sometimes did. His body looked more comfortable. Richard didn't interrupt. He waited until they came back inside. Later, during dinner, he sat across from Noah and watched closely. His son's eyes followed Julia as she walked past with a tray. Richard hadn't seen that kind of awareness in years. It wasn't just routine anymore. There was presence. Richard finally asked Julia, "What are you doing differently?" She shrugged slightly. "Just letting him be near what calms him," she said. That answer stuck with him. It wasn't a complicated method. There were no machines or special programs involved. It was about noticing and respecting the small things. And for the first time, Richard began to believe something was changing. Richard started joining them on some of their walks. At first, he stayed a few steps behind, letting Julia lead. He didn't want to disrupt whatever was happening. He watched as she calmly moved Noah's chair toward the fountain or sat quietly near the pool. Noah didn't react strongly, but he was different. There was less tension in his face and body. Richard remembered how all the experts had tried to force interaction. They had brought toys, flashing lights, sound machines, but none of it worked. Now, with Julia, there were no expectations, just silence and attention. Richard began to think this might be the path he had been looking for. Maybe the key wasn't in fixing or teaching, but in waiting and listening. He felt something shift inside him too. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel hope, not a dramatic, life-changing kind of hope, just enough to keep going. Enough to believe that maybe finally there was a way forward. As the days passed, the house continued to change in small but important ways. Julia didn't treat Noah like a problem to solve. She treated him like someone who had his own way of seeing the world. She never asked for progress, but progress came anyway. Noah didn't speak, but he was no longer completely distant. His body moved more freely when they were outside. His eyes stayed focused longer. And sometimes, when the water ran in the kitchen or the rain hit the windows, he looked toward it with calm curiosity. Richard saw it too. Every small change gave him more reason to believe. What once felt like a silent, empty world was slowly filling with signals. Not words, but signs. Julia had found something inside the silence, and now they were all beginning to feel it. Richard still didn't know where it would lead, but he could see it clearly now. A new path had begun, and it all started with those quiet reactions to water. It was a hot afternoon, and the sun was still high in the sky. Julia pushed Noah's wheelchair slowly down the garden path, following the usual routine they had developed over the past few weeks. The garden had become a peaceful space for both of them. She took him near the pool where he usually relaxed. The water shimmered quietly, and Julia sat beside him, wiping his forehead with a cool towel. Noah didn't move much, but she could see his body wasn't tense like it used to be. After a while, she noticed he was sweating more than usual. His shirt was damp and his hands were sticky. She thought it might help to give him a bath. It was a simple idea, nothing planned, just something that made sense at the moment. So she gently turned his chair around and brought him back inside the house. Richard was in his study. Julia didn't tell anyone. She just did what felt right. Inside the bathroom, Julia took her time. She turned on the water and checked the temperature with her hand. She didn't want it too hot or too cold. When it was just right, she filled a plastic basin and placed it beside her. She gently rolled up Noah's sleeves and removed his shirt. His body was stiff at first, as it often was, but she moved slowly and calmly. She dipped a soft towel into the water and began wiping his arms, starting from the shoulders down to his hands. As she cleaned him, she softly hummed a tune, not a song with words, just a quiet melody she remembered from her childhood. Her voice was low and steady. It wasn't meant to entertain. It was just something to keep the moment warm and gentle. Noah didn't react right away. His eyes stayed half closed. But Julia noticed his breathing stayed even. He wasn't anxious. He felt safe. She continued washing his arms, then his hands, rubbing gently between his fingers. The bathroom was quiet except for the sound of the water in the bowl and her soft humming. She supported Noah carefully so he wouldn't slip or fall. She kept one hand on his back as she rinsed his arms with another towel. It was just a regular moment of care, with no expectations. That's when it happened. Richard had been walking down the hallway, heading to the kitchen, when he noticed the bathroom door slightly open. He didn't mean to spy, but something made him stop. He glanced inside and saw Julia crouched beside the tub, gently washing Noah's arms. Her face looked calm and focused. Then out of nowhere, a short, light laugh came from Noah. It wasn't loud, it was almost like a hiccup, but it was clear. It was real. Richard froze. For a second he thought he imagined it, but he hadn't. Noah had laughed. The sound was soft, but it hit Richard like a shock. He stood completely still, his hand resting on the wall. For years, he had dreamed about hearing his son's voice. Therapists had tried games, machines, and strategies to provoke reactions. None of it had worked. Now, without planning, without therapy, in the middle of a simple bath, Noah had laughed. Julia didn't look up right away. She had heard it too, but she didn't make a big deal about it. She smiled gently and kept moving the towel across his skin. Noah's mouth curled slightly and his shoulders relaxed. Richard took a deep breath. He didn't want to interrupt. He slowly stepped away from the door and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. That sound, short and quiet, was the most powerful thing he had heard in years. It wasn't forced. It wasn't the result of any program. It came from comfort, from trust, from the ordinary moment Julia had created. After a few minutes, Julia finished the bath. She dried Noah's arms and helped him back into a clean shirt. He didn't resist or tense up. Everything about him seemed a little lighter. She wrapped a towel around his shoulders and slowly wheeled him back to his room. Richard stepped aside as they passed. Julia gave him a small nod, but didn't say anything. She had seen his face. She knew he had heard it. Later that evening, Richard came to Noah's room. He sat beside his son and watched him sleep. His hand rested gently on Noah's blanket. That laugh kept playing in his head. Not just the sound, but what it meant. It was proof that something was happening, something real. It wasn't a breakthrough in the way experts described it. It was just a crack in the silence, but even a small crack was enough. It changed everything. For the first time, Richard felt that maybe his son was finally reaching out. That night, the mansion felt different. Julia went back to her room and sat on her bed for a while, thinking. She didn't cry and she didn't call anyone to tell the story. She just sat quietly, feeling something inside her shift. She hadn't expected anything from the bath. She was just trying to take care of Noah, like always. But now there was a moment to remember. A real moment, the first laugh. It wasn't long or loud, but it was the first. Richard stayed up late, unable to sleep. He kept walking through the house, replaying the scene in his mind, the bath, Julia's humming, Noah's soft voice. It had all happened in such a quiet way, but the meaning was huge. Years of silence had been broken, not with force or pressure, but with gentle care. That sound stayed with both of them. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a signal, a small one, but enough to change everything from that day on. After the moment in the bathroom, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard. That short laugh from Noah had changed something deep inside him. Since that day, he started paying even more attention to the time Julia spent with his son. He began watching from a distance, always silent, careful not to interrupt. Julia continued her calm routine with Noah, taking him outside, sitting by the pool, washing his hands, and reading quietly in the shade. She didn't celebrate small things loudly. She kept everything natural, as if every new reaction from Noah was part of a slow, patient process. Richard didn't ask questions. He just watched and listened. A few days later, something new happened. While sitting near the pool, Julia placed a yellow rubber duck beside Noah. It floated in a small basin of water. Without warning, Noah pointed at it and said one clear word, "Duck." Richard heard it. His chest tightened. He wasn't imagining it. Noah had spoken. Julia looked at Noah immediately. She didn't make a big reaction. Instead, she softly repeated, "Duck." Noah looked at the toy again and said it once more, this time slower, but still clearly. "Duck." Richard stood frozen. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was a real word. His son had just spoken his second word after years of silence. It wasn't part of any planned therapy or test. It happened naturally during a moment of calm. Julia gently placed her hand on Noah's arm and smiled. "Yes, Duck," she said again, keeping her voice steady and soft. Richard wanted to run and hug his son, but he held back. He didn't want to break the moment. Instead, he wiped his eyes and stepped away quietly, full of emotion. The sound of that word kept repeating in his mind. He realized that something big was happening. The wall of silence was slowly starting to fall, one word at a time. Julia used this moment to gently introduce more items into their routine. She brought a few toys, some books, and soft music. Each activity was quiet, simple, and free of pressure. She showed Noah picture books with animals and pointed at them one by one. She always gave time for him to look, react, or ignore. Sometimes he would touch the page, other times he would just follow her finger with his eyes. With music, she played soft melodies and sometimes hummed along. Noah didn't sing, but he began making sounds, short, soft ones. Julia didn't call them words, but they were more than silence. Richard often sat nearby, pretending to read, though his eyes stayed on Noah the entire time. He kept watching for signs, new sounds, longer eye contact, small gestures, and they came. Not fast, not loud, but they came. Noah would look at Julia when she spoke. He would touch her hand when she showed him a toy. Communication had begun. Now the time spent outdoors became the most important part of each day. Julia made it a habit to take Noah to the poolside every afternoon. She brought a small table with toys and books and set them up under a large umbrella. The sunlight reflected off the water, and Noah seemed to enjoy the brightness and movement. There were no distractions, just the sound of the water and the calm atmosphere. Julia sat beside him and talked softly, even when he didn't respond. Over time, he started to copy small sounds. He said "bar" when she showed him a picture of a ball. He said "moo" when she played the sound of a cow from a speaker. Sometimes he didn't say anything, but his eyes followed everything. These were clear signs that he was not only hearing, he was understanding. Richard watched all of this with tears in his eyes. It wasn't just progress. It was the beginning of something they had waited years for. Richard felt something new growing inside him. It was a feeling he hadn't trusted for a long time. Hope. Every new word, every sound, every sign of attention felt like a victory. He found himself waking up early, excited to check on Noah's day. He no longer saw Julia as just an employee. She had become a guide, someone who had opened a door he thought was locked forever. Richard started joining their sessions more often, sitting close, offering toys, and repeating simple words. At first, he was unsure how to help, but Julia guided him gently. "Just follow his lead," she said. So he did. When Noah said "cat" after seeing a photo, Richard smiled for hours. When he reached for Julia's hand during a song, Richard quietly took note. Each moment was a piece of a puzzle that had once felt impossible to solve. Now, that puzzle was slowly coming together, not through force but through time, patience, and genuine care. By the end of that week, the poolside had become more than just a quiet spot. It had turned into a place where Noah expressed himself more freely. He wasn't talking all the time, but he was trying. He made more sounds. He pointed at pictures. He touched toys with clear interest. His eyes showed focus that wasn't there before. The water, the sunlight, the calm, everything seemed to help. Julia remained consistent, never rushing him, never expecting too much at once. And Richard was there too, not as a boss or just a father, but as part of the moment. He had waited so long to hear his son speak, and now it was happening, slowly, but it was real. From that day forward, Richard looked at the pool not as a decoration, but as the place where his son found his voice. What started with a simple laugh had turned into something bigger. In that space, Noah had said, "Duck," and nothing would ever be the same. One morning, while cleaning the study room, Julia opened a cabinet that hadn't been touched in a long time. Inside were old files, boxes of papers, and medical documents stacked without order. She started organizing them, placing the folders in piles. Most were labeled with dates and names of clinics, therapists, or hospitals. Curious, she opened a few. What she read left her speechless. Page after page showed aggressive treatments, heavy medications, and methods focused on control rather than care. Some notes described Noah's behavior as unmanageable and suggested strong sedatives. Julia's hands trembled as she read reports recommending isolation, physical restraints, and constant drug use. The documents didn't show empathy or understanding, just an attempt to silence and manage him. She had never seen this side of Noah's history. She felt sick to her stomach. The boy she now knew, gentle, sensitive, aware, had been treated like a problem to be fixed. She placed the files in a box, took a deep breath, and went to find Richard. When Julia showed the documents to Richard, he sat down slowly and said nothing for a long time. His eyes moved across the pages, rereading them again and again. With every word, his face changed. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally guilt. He hadn't known the full extent of what had been done. At the time, after his wife died, he had trusted the doctors and followed their advice without question. He was desperate, scared, and broken. If someone had told him that a certain pill or treatment would help Noah, he agreed without thinking twice. He remembered sitting in long meetings with professionals who used complex words, promising results. He had believed them. Now, reading these reports, he realized that much of what Noah had suffered had nothing to do with help. It was about control. Richard closed the folder and looked at Julia. "I let this happen," he said quietly. "I let them do this to my son." His voice cracked. Julia didn't blame him, but she didn't lie either. "We need to do something," she said. Richard nodded. They couldn't undo the past, but they could make sure it didn't stay hidden. Together, they started reviewing all the files, organizing everything by date and type. They created a timeline of Noah's treatments, medications, and the professionals involved. Julia contacted a lawyer she trusted from a previous job. The lawyer was shocked after seeing the records. He explained that some of the treatments violated medical ethics and possibly the law. Richard then reached out to a journalist who covered health and special needs cases. She agreed to meet and listen. Within a week, Richard and Julia had compiled enough material to begin the process of exposing what had happened. It was painful. Every step reminded Richard of how much Noah had suffered while he thought he was doing the right thing. But they kept going, not out of revenge, but to bring the truth forward. As the legal and media process began, Richard and Julia didn't let it take over their daily life with Noah. They stayed focused on him. He still needed care, time, and love, especially now. Julia continued the daily routines. The sessions by the pool, the books, the songs, the quiet walks in the garden. Noah remained the center of it all. Every time he made a new sound or looked someone in the eye, it reminded them of why they were doing this. It wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition. Noah had never been broken. He had never been incapable. He had simply been misunderstood, over-medicated, and pushed into silence by systems that didn't listen. Now, they were listening. Richard found strength in these moments. Instead of sinking into guilt, he chose to act. Noah's progress, no matter how small, was their proof. Proof that love and understanding could reach where science had failed. Proof that Noah had always been there, waiting. As news of the case spread, more families came forward with similar stories. Other parents with autistic children shared experiences of misdiagnosis, abuse in clinics, and pressure to medicate without proper explanations. The journalist published a detailed article that gained national attention. Interviews followed. Richard chose to speak publicly, not as a billionaire, but as a father. He didn't hide his guilt. He shared everything, the decisions he had made, the trust he had placed in professionals, and the harm that followed. Julia remained at his side, quiet but firm. Her role had never been about attention. She had been the one to see Noah clearly for the first time, and now the world was finally seeing him too. The media began calling it a movement, one about listening, about changing how autistic children were treated. But for Richard and Julia, it was personal. Every headline, every new message from another family, all led back to one goal: protecting Noah and making sure no child was ever treated like that again. Despite the chaos outside, the interviews, the legal meetings, the constant calls, inside the mansion, peace was starting to grow. Noah, unaware of everything, continued to respond in his own way. He smiled more often. He made more sounds. He looked directly at Julia and Richard. He pointed to objects he wanted. One afternoon, while playing with a toy, he said "blue" and looked straight at Richard. It was simple, but it was more than Richard ever dreamed of. That one word made everything worth it. The pain, the guilt, the public exposure, all of it faded in comparison. The truth was now exposed. There was no going back. The files Julia had found, once hidden in a dusty cabinet, had opened a door to justice, awareness, and healing. What science couldn't do, love was doing slowly, day by day. And with every look, every sound, every moment of connection, Noah showed them the same truth over and over again. He was never gone, just waiting to be understood. As the case against the doctors gained attention in the news, life inside the Wakefield mansion continued to change in quiet but meaningful ways. While journalists called daily and lawyers prepared documents, Julia focused on Noah's routine. That routine had grown. Every morning now started with a short session at the kitchen table. Julia brought simple picture cards with words like ball, book, and water. One day, when she held up the word bola in Portuguese, Noah smiled and said ball in English, pointing at the red ball beside him. Another time, when she asked if he wanted to read, he softly said, read. The progress was slow but steady. Julia kept a notebook and wrote everything down, each word, sound, and gesture. Richard was always close by. He no longer just observed. He participated. He repeated words, clapped gently when Noah responded, and helped during playtime. They were no longer waiting for progress. They were living it. It was part of their daily life now. Julia introduced more creative activities to help Noah express himself. She brought finger paints, big sheets of paper, and safe tools for him to try. At first, Noah only watched. But one afternoon, Julia placed a bit of blue paint on his finger and gently guided his hand toward the paper. He looked unsure, but didn't pull away. Slowly, he began pressing his fingers onto the surface. The texture seemed to catch his attention. Then, without help, he dipped his finger again and made another mark. Julia smiled. Richard stood behind them, recording the moment on his phone. Soon, painting became part of their afternoon routine. Julia set up a small corner of the living room with art supplies. Noah sometimes mixed colors or used his whole hand to smear paint across the page. He didn't care about making shapes. What mattered was the act itself. Through paint, he explored, played, and reacted. It was another way for him to connect with the world. They also tried new things during story time. Julia picked simple books with big pictures and short sentences. She read them slowly, pointing to the images. Noah sat beside her, sometimes on the floor, sometimes on a pillow. His attention improved. He would reach out to turn the pages or make sounds when a picture caught his interest. Once, during a story about animals, he said dog and pointed before she even read the word. Another time, he laughed during a funny scene. These reactions weren't forced. They came naturally. Julia continued reading to him every day. Sometimes Richard joined, taking turns reading pages or acting out parts of the story to make it more fun. They also added bubble play to the routine. Julia would blow soap bubbles in the backyard, and Noah would chase them with his eyes, trying to pop them with his fingers. The laughter that came from him during these sessions was pure and real. It filled the house. Communication between them wasn't only about spoken language. It was also in the way Noah looked at them, the way he waited for responses, and the small sounds he made. Julia began to understand his rhythm, when he needed space, when he was interested, and when he was tired. Richard noticed it too. He learned to read Noah's gestures. A point meant he wanted something. A tap meant he wanted to repeat an activity. Noah didn't need full sentences to make himself understood. His expressions said enough. Sometimes he made a sound and waited. Julia would answer back with a similar sound, and they would repeat it together like a game. Richard started doing the same. These exchanges, though simple, carried meaning. They were real conversations, just not in the traditional way. Noah's world had once been silent and distant. Now it was active, filled with attention and interaction. Every sound, every look, every movement became part of a growing bond that words alone couldn't describe. The pool continued to be a special place. Almost every afternoon, Julia and Richard took Noah outside. They brought toys that floated and colorful objects to keep nearby. Noah didn't swim on his own, but with help, he kicked his legs and splashed with his hands. He smiled often, sometimes laughing when water hit his face. In the water, he seemed more confident, more present. Julia noticed that he was more likely to speak or make sounds when they were near the pool. She used this to encourage him gently. Sometimes she asked, "What color?" and held up a floating toy. If he said the color, they would clap softly. If he didn't, they moved on without pressure. Richard also created small games, like counting splashes or making silly faces underwater. Noah enjoyed these games. He didn't just participate, he responded, clearly and with joy. The pool had become a place of freedom. It was where Noah could move, laugh, and be fully himself. Inside the house, the atmosphere had completely changed. What was once cold and quiet now felt full of life. Books were left open on tables, toys were scattered across the floor, music played softly in the background, sometimes instrumental, sometimes children's songs. There were small changes everywhere. Art from Noah's sessions taped to the walls, cushions on the floor for play, and boxes of picture cards near the couch. Julia kept a journal on the counter, always ready to note something new. Richard, once constantly busy or distracted, now spent most of his time at home. He no longer looked tired. He laughed more. He listened. Every moment with Noah felt like a step forward. The hope they once held carefully, afraid it would break, now stood strong. It had grown roots. Noah wasn't healing in the medical sense. He was growing, learning, connecting. He was happy, and the house reflected that. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And finally, it felt like a home. Over time, Julia became more than just the woman who cared for Noah. She became part of the family. Her presence was no longer something new. It was something permanent. Richard trusted her completely, and Noah looked for her every morning. The three of them now shared most parts of the day together. Meals, reading sessions, painting time, walks in the garden, all were done as a team. Richard and Julia didn't talk about what they were. They didn't need to. Their bond wasn't based on labels. It was based on presence, honesty, and shared care for Noah. They helped each other without asking. When one was tired, the other took over. When Noah laughed or said a new word, they celebrated it together. They didn't always agree, but they respected each other. The connection grew naturally. One morning during an art session, Noah picked up a crayon and drew 3 simple figures. They were holding hands. He pointed and said, "It's us." That moment stayed in their hearts. Julia smiled when she saw the drawing. Richard leaned over and looked closely. The shapes were simple, but the message was clear. Noah saw them as a unit, connected, safe, together. He had never said something like that before. Julia placed the drawing on the fridge, holding back tears. Richard didn't say anything right away, but he nodded slowly and sat beside Noah. No one needed to explain what the drawing meant. It said everything. For Julia, it was a sign that her place in their lives was real. For Richard, it was proof that Noah felt the bond too. Their connection wasn't just in actions, it was now in words, images, and shared understanding. After all the years of silence, that small phrase, "It's us," carried more meaning than a long speech. That afternoon, they didn't follow any specific routine. They just spent time together. They sat in the living room, played quietly, and shared a calm moment that didn't need to be explained. The pain from the past didn't disappear. Julia still carried the memory of her daughter. Richard still felt guilt for the mistakes he had made with Noah's treatments. But now, the pain didn't isolate them. It connected them. They understood each other without needing to go into details every time. Some nights they sat outside after Noah went to bed and just talked. Sometimes about the day, sometimes about their losses, sometimes about nothing at all. These talks weren't dramatic. They were real. When one felt overwhelmed, the other listened. When one needed space, it was respected. Julia didn't try to fix Richard's pain. And Richard didn't ask Julia to forget hers. They simply shared it. In sharing, the pain softened. It became something they carried together, not alone. They were building something new, not perfect, not free of sadness, but solid and filled with care. And in the middle of it all was Noah, growing, learning, and changing the lives around him. The legal process was still active. Lawyers continued working and journalists followed up on the story. But inside the house, life had settled into a stable rhythm. The legal fight was important, but it wasn't the center of their lives anymore. Their focus was on Noah. Every morning started with quiet routines. Noah would eat breakfast with Julia and Richard. Then came reading time, playtime, and often a walk outside. Sometimes Julia brought new tools, different textures, new sounds, or puzzles to see how Noah reacted. Some things he ignored, others caught his attention. He still had moments where he needed quiet, and they respected that. But there were also more moments of joy, words, gestures, and real interaction. Richard no longer felt desperate for progress. He accepted Noah's rhythm. Julia helped him see that growth doesn't always look big, it's in the details. In how Noah waited for her voice, how he reached out for Richard's hand, how he smiled more often now. That was real progress. The house, once full of cold silence, now had life in every corner. There were drawings on the fridge, toys on the floor, soft music in the background, and open books on every table. They didn't worry about making everything perfect. What mattered was the feeling, warmth, presence, support. On some afternoons, they all sat by the pool. Julia would blow bubbles, and Noah would chase them, laughing and clapping. Sometimes Richard joined in, sometimes he just watched, happy to see his son like that. These were not special occasions, they were just part of their days. Noah still had difficulties. He still didn't speak full sentences, and some days he needed extra quiet. But those things didn't define him anymore. He was not just a boy with challenges. He was a boy with personality, preferences, and a growing voice. The silence that once surrounded him had changed. It was no longer something painful. It was simply a pause between the beautiful moments of connection. One evening, after putting Noah to sleep, Julia and Richard sat at the kitchen table. They didn't talk much. Julia sipped tea while Richard looked at Noah's latest drawing. It showed 3 figures again, still holding hands, but now with smiles drawn on their faces. Julia reached over and touched the paper. "He's happy," she said. Richard nodded. "We all are," he replied. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was simple, quiet, and true. They didn't need more words. The home they had built together wasn't perfect, but it was full of love. The silence, once so heavy, now felt natural. It came and went, but it didn't hurt anymore. It was part of their rhythm, just a space between laughter, between spoken words, between glances that said everything. Noah was still growing, still learning, and they were growing with him. There was still work to do, but for now they had each other. And in that small, peaceful moment, it truly felt like a new beginning. The trial finally came to an end after weeks of testimonies, evidence, and emotional moments. The courtroom had been tense from the beginning. Lawyers presented documents, expert witnesses spoke, and parents from other families shared their stories. Richard sat through every session, often with Julia by his side. He didn't speak much to the press, but he listened to everything. The former doctor, once praised in elite circles, now sat silently as the judge read the verdict, guilty on multiple counts: misconduct, negligence, and emotional harm. The courtroom stayed quiet for a moment before a few quiet gasps filled the air. Richard closed his eyes. Justice had been done. It didn't erase the past, but it acknowledged the truth. After so many years of silence, someone had answered. He didn't celebrate. There was no victory party, no public statement. He simply returned home, knowing something important had been corrected. The legal battle was over, but life at home was just beginning a new chapter. Back at the mansion, Richard decided to make a change. He walked through the house and stopped in a room that had once been used for storage. It had large windows and lots of natural light. The space had been empty for years. Now he wanted to give it a purpose. He hired a contractor to clean and paint the walls, install new lights, and add shelves for supplies. Within 2 weeks, it was ready. A quiet art studio just for Noah. Julia helped arrange everything: brushes in jars, stacks of blank paper, rows of finger paint, and a small speaker for soft music. The center of the room held a wide table where Noah could sit or stand. When he entered for the first time, his eyes scanned the room with curiosity. Julia handed him a brush. Noah dipped it into a pot of blue paint without hesitation and pressed it onto the paper. It wasn't just painting, it was expression. He smiled as he worked. Noah began to spend time in the studio every day. It became his favorite place in the house. He painted in silence sometimes, and other times he hummed simple songs while choosing colors. Blue appeared in almost every piece, sometimes soft, sometimes bold. It reminded everyone of the pool, his happy place. Other colors followed: yellow for sunlight, green for the garden, red for his favorite toy truck. Each color held meaning. Julia stayed nearby, always patient and gentle. She never corrected him or asked him to paint a certain way. She let him lead. Some days he would say the names of the colors aloud: blue, green, yellow. Other times he would sing short melodies while drawing shapes. The studio was filled with laughter, humming, and the light tapping of brushes. Richard often stood at the door just watching. He didn't always go in. Sometimes watching from a distance was enough. Each painting Noah made felt like a message, a piece of himself shared openly. The house had truly changed. It no longer felt quiet in a sad way. Now, the silence was simply space between moments of joy. The living room often had toys spread out, music playing low in the background, and the smell of Julia's cooking in the air. The kitchen had drawings on the fridge, and shelves with labeled boxes for activities. Richard, who once walked through the house like a shadow, now joined in. He read books with Noah, helped mix paint, and sometimes even tried painting himself. Julia laughed when his brush strokes were messy, and Noah giggled at his funny attempts. Laughter had become part of the rhythm of their days. Noah hugged more. He asked for favorite songs. He painted handprints on the wall of the studio with Richard's help. Every detail, the smell of paint, the colors on Noah's hands, the soft music, the gentle hugs, was a reminder that happiness wasn't a dream anymore. It was part of their real, everyday life. Richard often found himself stopping to observe. He didn't always need to join in. Sometimes he just paused and took it all in. Noah painting with full focus, Julia wiping his hands with care, music playing softly, and sunlight coming through the window. It was simple, but it meant everything. Years ago, he would have never imagined this kind of peace. Back then, his days were filled with pressure, silence, and desperation. Now, they were filled with meaning. He no longer chased impossible solutions. Instead, he appreciated the little things, like the smell of wet paint, the sound of Noah saying blue with confidence, or the moment Julia and Noah laughed at a paint spill. These weren't big events. They were tiny moments, but they were alive, honest, and full of connection. Richard didn't speak about happiness in big words. He didn't need to. He simply felt it. And every time he saw Noah create something with joy, he knew this was the life they had been waiting for. The family was no longer defined by what had been lost. They were now shaped by what they had built. The damage from the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer controlled them. The judgment had brought closure. The art room had brought purpose. And Noah's progress had brought light. Julia remained the heart of it all, calm, kind, and always there. Noah kept painting, singing, and naming colors. His connection to the world grew stronger every day. He no longer felt distant. He was present, expressive, and joyful. Richard didn't talk about the future much. He focused on the now. And now, things were good. He still had fears. He still worried some days, but overall he felt calm. The home that was once filled with pain had been rebuilt with patience and love. The laughter, the paint on the table, the softness in Noah's voice. It was all real. The healing wasn't just emotional, it was complete. Their life, finally, was whole again. Several years had passed. Noah was now a teenager, taller and more confident with his own rhythm, voice, and personality. A national event was being held in the city to honor people who had made significant progress in the face of difficult personal journeys. One of the main names on the list was Noah Wakefield. His story had inspired thousands, first as a child who overcame silence and later as a voice for change. He was invited to speak, and he accepted. The event took place in a large auditorium filled with people, families, professionals, journalists, and supporters. Noah arrived with Julia beside him, both dressed for the occasion. He wore a blue suit, his favorite color since childhood. Julia held his hand as they walked toward the stage. Cameras flashed. The moment was important, but what came next was even more meaningful. After they reached the microphone, the host made a public announcement that caught the audience by surprise. Julia was now Noah's legal adoptive mother. The applause filled the room instantly. Julia turned to Noah, overwhelmed. Her hands covered her face as tears streamed down. Noah looked at her and smiled gently. Then, in front of everyone, he leaned in and hugged her tightly. The crowd stood up. Many clapped. Some wiped their eyes. The bond between them was undeniable. Julia had raised Noah with care, respect, and patience. The legal recognition only confirmed what they had been living for years. She was his mother in every way. Richard, seated in the front row, watched everything quietly. He didn't need to say a word. His expression said everything. The man who once carried guilt had now found peace, knowing his son was safe, happy, and loved. Julia stepped back from the microphone. It was Noah's turn to speak. He opened a folded paper he had prepared. He took a deep breath and began reading slowly with a steady voice that filled the room with meaning and presence. "My light started at the pool," Noah said clearly, looking out at the audience. "With her." He paused for a second and looked toward Julia. She smiled through her tears. The audience listened closely as he continued. "Before that, I didn't know how to speak. I didn't know how to show what I felt. But she waited. She saw me. And now, I'm not afraid anymore." His words were simple, but each one carried deep emotion. "I used to live in silence. Now I live with love." The room was silent, but not empty. It was the kind of silence filled with emotion, attention, respect, and admiration. When he finished, everyone stood again and clapped. Noah didn't look nervous. He looked proud. Julia placed her arm around his shoulder as they walked off the stage. People reached out to shake hands, say thank you, and congratulate them. It wasn't just about Noah's progress. It was about how their story had helped others find hope too. At the reception after the event, several families approached Julia and Noah. Some brought their children, others came alone. They shared stories of struggle, years of silence, rejection from professionals, and the fear of never hearing a word from their own children. Julia listened to every story with patience. Noah stood beside her, sometimes joining in, sometimes just listening. A woman with a young boy hugged Julia and whispered, "Thank you for showing us it's possible." A father with tears in his eyes told Noah, "You gave my son the courage to speak in front of his class." The room was full of emotional conversations. Richard also received quiet thanks from people who had followed the legal case and respected his decision to step back and let Julia lead. That night was more than a celebration. It was a meeting of people who had all in some way been touched by the same kind of journey, one filled with patience, fear, progress, and deep love. When they arrived home that evening, the house felt calm, familiar, safe. Noah walked to his room, still wearing the blue suit, holding the medal from the ceremony in one hand. He placed it gently on the shelf, right next to the old drawing he had made years ago, the one with 3 people holding hands. He stood there for a while, looking at it. The drawing had faded a little over time, but it was still clear. It showed Richard, Julia, and himself. That moment, the feeling behind it, was now fully real. The connection that started in quiet rooms and slow routines had grown into something solid, something unshakable. Julia came into the room, and Noah turned around to hug her again. They didn't say anything, they didn't need to. The gesture said enough. Richard passed by in the hallway and smiled when he saw them. This was their family, built slowly, not by blood, but by time, care, and truth. The silence that once filled the mansion was long gone. In its place were new sounds, Noah's voice reading, the gentle hum of music in the kitchen, and laughter coming from rooms filled with life. The past wasn't forgotten, but it didn't define them anymore. Julia was no longer just the caregiver who arrived during a time of pain. She was now his mother in name, role, and heart. Richard had changed too. He learned how to love in a new way, letting go of control and finding joy in watching from beside instead of leading. And Noah, once a quiet boy who couldn't express his feelings, now stood on stages, shared his story, and used his voice with pride. That night, as the house grew quiet again, it wasn't the heavy, empty silence of years before. It was peaceful, full of meaning. There was no need for anything more. The silence belonged to the past. Now there was love, and more importantly, there was voice. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe until next time.